Hi, everyone. It's Melissa Kishie, Senior Vice President here at Edison Research. 5 years ago, our team came together with a vision to launch a product to help better understand weekly podcast listeners and redefine how podcast reach is measured. Through collaboration, innovation, and dedication, Edison Podcast Metrics was born and is now an indispensable tool to creators, networks, agencies, and advertisers alike. While many eagerly anticipate the release of our top podcast lists in the US and the UK each quarter, Edison Podcast Metrics provides a treasure trove of insights into how, when, and where weekly podcast listeners engage with their content. One thing we've tracked from the beginning is the service weekly podcast listeners use most often to listen to podcasts. When Edison Podcast Metrics kicked off in late 2019, Apple Podcasts dominated with 25% of weekly podcast listeners choosing it as the service they use most to listen to podcasts. It surpassed YouTube at 20% and Spotify at 13%. Fast forward to 2021, and we see Spotify jump ahead with 26% of weekly podcast listeners choosing it as the service they use most to listen to podcasts. YouTube stayed fairly steady at 19%, while Apple Podcasts dipped to 18%. Finally, just recently, YouTube, the platform most often associated with video content, has risen to the top. As of Q3 2024, 30% of weekly podcast listeners choose YouTube as the service they use most often to listen to podcasts. Spotify moves to second at 29%, and Apple Podcasts drops to 15%. With Spotify doubling down on video, we may continue to see shifts in podcast listener habits. Luckily, Edison Podcast Metrics will be there to measure them and keep the industry up to date. Look for more 5-year trending data from the Edison team in early 2025. Happy anniversary, Edison Podcast Metrics!